People who knew the killers. When did you realize something was wrong? User under the nickname Raventails. I was 16 when I met him. My mother rented out a small room in our house to supplement her income, and that is how we ended up with him as a tenant. He seemed quiet at first, polite enough, always keeping to himself in that cramped space near the back of our hallway. I remember how he never smiled, how his eyes always darted away if I tried to make conversation, and how certain nights I would wake up to the sound of him pacing back and forth, as though he could not find peace in his own mind. He told me once he had grown up in a difficult environment, so I chalked up his oddities to a rough past. My mother was more wary. She said from the moment she saw him, something cold seemed to flicker behind his gaze. Weeks passed, and he remained civil, if distant. But I started noticing small things. He would sometimes leave in the middle of the night, returning before dawn, looking exhausted, as though he had spent hours doing something that left him void of emotion. One day, I saw faint scratches on his arms. He wore long sleeves, yet the fabric shifted enough for me to glimpse red lines. When I asked about them, he shrugged, said it was from working outside. Then he walked away, as though my question had offended him. My mother kept telling me that she did not feel safe. She insisted that once the lease was up, we should not renew. She said his presence cast a shadow over the home. I tried to be kind, to see him as just a damaged soul who needed patience. I was wrong. One evening, near midnight, I was reading alone in the living room. My mother was out working a late shift. He emerged from his room, face pale, eyes wide, hair disheveled. He paused at the end of the hallway, noticing me on the couch. Our eyes locked, and I felt an icy jolt in my stomach. He mumbled something about going for a drive, stuffed his hands in his pockets, and left the house. I remember the air felt heavy, a hush too thick to ignore. Something was off, so I tried to distract myself with music. By the time my mother came home, I was fast asleep. I awoke to find police cars on our street. Neighbors murmured about a murder. A young woman had been found strangled behind a gas station not far from our neighborhood. My mother and I exchanged looks, worried but not suspecting him. Then the days turned into weeks, and the police presence died down. But I noticed his moods shifting. He would be unusually cheerful one day, then silent for the next 3, as though he wrestled with invisible demons. My mother approached him about renewing the lease. He snapped, told her he was leaving anyway, that he had found a new spot. My mother breathed relief, saying she wanted her house back without that tension. He left quietly, no goodbyes, no forwarding address. My mother changed the locks and we tried to move on. Months later, an older neighbor told us that a man had been arrested for killing a woman behind the gas station, and that the suspect resembled the tenant who once lived with us. At first, I dismissed it as rumor, but curiosity drove me to search local news stories. I found a grainy mugshot. My blood ran cold. It was him, the same face that had once sat at our dinner table, the same eyes that avoided mine in the hallway. According to police, he had strangled that woman in a fit of rage. They suspected he might have been linked to other cases. They had found items in his new place that tied him to more crimes. I stared at the article for what felt like hours, remembering how I had tried to rationalize his behavior, how I told myself he was just a damaged soul. Meanwhile, he was hiding monstrous secrets in the next room. That was the day I realized just how close we had been to danger. I still get nightmares thinking about how I would hear him pacing, how easy it would have been for me to be a victim if he had turned that rage toward us. My mother never forgave herself for letting him move in. As for me, I learned that the face of a killer can appear ordinary, unassuming, even quietly polite, until the truth surfaces and you realize the signs were there all along. User under the nickname Moonlight Witness. I was 19, working part-time in a small diner tucked away off a busy street. We had our share of odd regulars. Lonely men, exhausted parents, the occasional lost tourist. But one of them stood out, a man who came in every Tuesday evening, always ordering the same meal, always talking to himself in low undertones. My boss told me not to bother him, that he was a local with a tragic past, rumored to have spent time in jail. He never caused a scene, so I thought nothing of it. He was quiet, respectful enough. I would bring him his black coffee and greasy burger. Sometimes I would catch him staring at me, though, and it made my skin crawl. He wore a cap pulled low, eyes flicking around as if scanning the room for threats. I tried small talk once, a polite greeting. He stared at me for a moment, then asked if I believed in redemption. The question seemed random, but I answered that I did, that anyone could change. He let out a strange chuckle that sounded hollow, then thanked me. The next Tuesday he came again, but this time he stayed past closing, still sipping coffee. My boss told me to ask him to leave. I approached him carefully. He looked up, gave me a half smile, and said he wanted a place to think. I insisted he had to go, or else I'd get in trouble. He nodded and walked out. The entire time, I felt uneasy, as if his presence was heavier than normal. A few weeks later, I was wiping tables when a breaking news segment on the diner's television showed his face. He was arrested for a double homicide. Felt like a punch to the gut. He had apparently followed 2 women home from a bar, stabbed them both in a fit of rage. The reporter mentioned his prior record, his suspicious behavior, how the neighbor said they heard screams. My heart sank because I'd seen that face every Tuesday, asked him polite questions, joked that he was our best Tuesday tipper. Now I realized I'd been serving coffee to a murderer. My boss turned pale, cursing under his breath. I tried to recall if I'd noticed any overt red flags. He never threatened me, but he had that vacant stare, that question about redemption, as though he wrestled with darkness. Maybe he was fighting urges the entire time. The thought that I gave him a place to sit and brood over coffee while he planned more violence still sickens me. Sometimes people assume you can spot a killer a mile away, that they'd have a wild look or rant about violent fantasies. But this man was subdued, quietly tormented perhaps, but never flamboyant. He never once made me suspect he was capable of murder. Now, looking back, I see the subtle signs. The tension in his hands, how they trembled occasionally, the way he asked about redemption, his reluctance to leave at closing. Hints of a turmoil brewing inside. I think about how easy it was to dismiss him as another troubled soul, never imagining the extremes of what he had done, or what he could do again. After the news broke, the diner saw a wave of curious locals asking if I'd ever suspected. No, I would say, he was just a regular customer who never raised his voice, never demanded anything beyond a refill. That is the scariest part. The face of evil can slip right by your guard, sipping coffee in a corner booth. User under the nickname Evening Hollow. I met a man in college who seemed harmless. He was in my literature class, a lanky fellow with messy hair and a sleepy gaze. He often wore the same jacket, smelling faintly of smoke, but he was soft-spoken, even polite. We worked together on a group project analyzing some 19th century novel. My impression was that he was bored by academics but tried to get by. We chatted idly about campus life, about the parties he occasionally attended. He seemed perpetually tired, as though weighed down by more than just coursework. I recall he had a strange habit of rubbing his wrist, as if a phantom pain lingered there. Midway through the semester, he disappeared from class for about a week. I asked around. No one knew where he went. Then he returned, glancing over his shoulder, ignoring questions. People said maybe he had personal issues. I let it go. Near finals, I ran into him outside the library. He looked hollow-eyed, asked if I had the notes he missed. I offered them, and he just stared at me, eyes flicking from my face to the floor. That conversation ended awkwardly, and I felt a chill run through me, though I could not explain why. He was arrested for killing his roommate and burying the body in a shallow grave near an abandoned lot. The campus erupted in shock. We discovered that the roommate had been missing for weeks, until someone found blood in the dorm. My mind reeled. How could that subdued classmate commit something so vicious? Rumors flew. Maybe he was addicted to something, maybe it was a dispute over money or a personal feud. The reality was that it never crossed my mind that he could kill. He never talked about violence, never showed aggression. People called him lazy but never menacing. Only in hindsight do I recall the haunted look in his eyes, the tension in his posture, how I'd noticed him flinch at sudden noises. But none of that signaled homicide to me at the time. I realized the moment I saw his mugshot that I'd been in multiple group projects with a killer. He had read paragraphs aloud from classic novels, sat across from me in the cafeteria, emailed me about deadlines. Meanwhile, somewhere behind that quiet demeanor, a capacity for extreme violence festered. That revelation shattered any naive trust one had in reading people at face value. Now I watch strangers more carefully, aware that some horrors lie just beneath the surface, hidden by a fragile mask of normalcy. User under the nickname Seasparrow. He was my cousin's boyfriend, an ex-con who seemed determined to rebuild his life. My cousin was naive, insisted he was misunderstood, that he had just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He moved in with her, and I'd see them at family gatherings. Everyone was tense around him, but my cousin's unwavering loyalty kept us polite. He claimed he was done with his old life, working odd jobs, hoping to stay out of trouble. I tried to be open-minded. He was polite enough, though he rarely laughed. Whenever the topic of anything violent came up, he would go silent, eyes downcast. Once, at a barbecue, I noticed him staring at a steak knife on the table with an intensity that unnerved me. He caught my look, forced a grin, put the knife aside, and changed the subject. Another time, he told me calmly that you never really escape your past, that sometimes it hunts you down. I found that statement cryptic, but brushed it off. 6 months later, the news broke that he had stabbed my cousin to death in her own apartment. The story was horrifying. She had apparently threatened to leave him, and he snapped. By the time paramedics arrived, it was too late. He fled the scene, leading police on a short manhunt before being caught. My entire family was shattered. We had all suspected he was a bad influence, but not a killer. Yet looking back, the signs were there. The tension when arguments flared, the way he sometimes clenched his fists, how my cousin's eyes often looked anxious in his presence. At the time, I told myself he was just reserved, but the truth was likely that he wrestled with violent impulses. Now I regret not urging my cousin to break away sooner, or at least to see the danger. She loved him, believed in his rehabilitation. That love cost her life. That is when I realized how normal a killer can look, sitting on our porch, sipping lemonade, while behind that facade, a readiness to commit the ultimate act lay coiled. I still cannot believe I chatted casually with the man who would murder my own flesh and blood. User under the nickname Desert Glow. He was the teenage neighbor kid, always playing outside when I was younger. We would sometimes ride bikes together, though he was older by a couple of years. He seemed normal, maybe a bit quiet. I recall him catching lizards and insects, placing them in jars. I found that odd but not alarming. He liked reading weird books about dissecting animals, but I figured he was just curious. Our parents never worried much. Then one day, I saw him corner a stray cat in his yard, picking it up roughly. I told him to put the cat down, but he only smirked. The cat scratched him, and he flung it aside, cursing. That was the first time I glimpsed a flash of cruelty. My gut twisted, but at the time I was too young to confront him. Over the next few months, I heard rumors he set traps for small animals. Once, a local dog went missing. There was no proof he was involved, but I recall people whispering. Eventually, my family moved away, and I lost track of him. I saw a news article. That same kid, now a young adult, had been arrested for a brutal murder. The victim was a hitchhiker he picked up. The details were horrific. In the interview, a detective mentioned how many serial predators start with harming animals. My mind shot back to that day with the stray cat. All the puzzle pieces clicked. I realized I had known a killer in the making. The warning signs had been there. The cruelty to animals, the fascination with dissecting them. People always say watch for such flags. We rarely think a neighbor kid we played with could become a murderer. But he did. I felt sick reading the article, thinking of the times we rode bikes, or that day I saw him fling the cat. If only I had told an adult more forcefully. Maybe someone would have intervened or recognized the pattern. Now an innocent hitchhiker was gone, and I live with the memory of how close we all came to ignoring that path of violence from the start. User under the nickname Nightshade. I worked in a convenience store near a highway exit. One of my coworkers was a tall, lanky guy named Jared. He had a sarcastic grin, always telling dark jokes. I was never comfortable around him, but he was one of those people who kept his job by performing just enough not to get fired. He bragged sometimes about bar fights, how he put people in their place. I thought he was just trying to sound tough. Then one slow night, he pulled a folding knife out, spinning it on the counter, telling me he liked the feeling of it. I felt uneasy and told him to put it away. He laughed and asked if I was scared. I said no, but inside I was trembling. Over the following weeks, I noticed he had sudden mood swings. One evening, after we closed up, I heard him mutter something about hating all these worthless people in our city, how he could fix them if he had a chance. The contempt in his tone was chilling. Next shift, he acted normal again, even friendly, so I brushed it off as ranting. Then, out of the blue, he quit. No notice, just walked out. A detective came to the store, asking if any of us remembered Jared. Turns out, he was arrested for stabbing 2 men in a random bar incident, one of whom died. The detective said Jared displayed no remorse, admitting he had always fantasized about teaching people lessons. My stomach churned. I recalled him spinning that knife, the sneer on his face when he teased me about fear. That was the day I realized I'd known a killer. He had not been subtle about his anger or fascination with violence, yet I never believed he would go that far. We think people exaggerate, not that they'd take someone's life. It haunts me to recall how I would stand next to him behind the counter, exchanging mundane conversation about coffee flavors, while behind that grin lurked a simmering rage. User under the nickname River Echo. We rented a lake cabin every summer. Our nearest neighbor was a middle-aged man who lived there year-round. My parents greeted him politely, but I found him unnerving. He had a habit of staring at me from across the water, a blank expression that made my skin crawl. My father said the man was shy, that we should not judge. Over the years, we saw him tinker around his boathouse, fish at odd hours. Once, when I was 15, I heard screams late at night from his property. My father insisted it was animals in the woods. The next morning, we asked the neighbor if everything was fine. He calmly said a bobcat had wandered onto his land, that he scared it off. My father accepted that explanation, but a pit formed in my stomach. Later that same summer, a local teenage girl vanished. Her body was found weeks afterward, deeper into the woods. The case went unsolved for a long time. We never suspected the neighbor, until a random break in the case led police to discover evidence tying him to that murder and several more. I was 20 by then, living elsewhere. My father called me in shock, saying the man had been arrested as a serial killer. He had allegedly preyed on people near that lake for over a decade, burying remains in secluded spots. I recalled all the times I walked alone by the shoreline. He had probably watched me from behind the trees. That knowledge is a cold dagger of fear. We never expected that an unassuming middle-aged fisherman by the lake, who politely nodded whenever we passed, could be a remorseless predator. That is when I understood how killers can hide behind normal routines, and how close I had been to becoming another victim if luck had swayed. My father still blames himself for trusting that quiet neighbor. User under the nickname Forest Wing. He was an acquaintance from a hiking club. We were not best friends, but I'd see him at monthly gatherings talking about trails, sharing tips on gear. He was mildly friendly, though I'd heard rumors he was controlling in relationships. Some said his ex had a restraining order, but no one verified. I had no reason to fear him directly. We swapped jokes, talked about which forests to explore next. Then he vanished from our meetups, and we heard he had parted ways with the club. People shrugged, saying maybe he was busy. I saw a breaking news article. He had shot his girlfriend and her new partner in a rage, then fled to the woods. My entire body trembled as I read the description of him barricading himself in a cabin until a SWAT team cornered him. The girlfriend and partner did not survive. The man I'd hiked with, who once gave me tips on filtering water from streams, turned out to be capable of a double homicide. I replayed mental snapshots of him cheerfully showing me how to tie a certain knot. That normalcy clashed with the brutality. In hindsight, the rumor about a restraining order was not just gossip. People had glimpsed controlling behavior in him, but we wrote it off as typical relationship drama, not potential murder. That is how I learned that a killer can be the person you share a hobby with, a person who jokes about mundane topics while harboring lethal anger. I sometimes wonder if I should have spotted more. Did I see him glare at others in the club with a slight edge? Maybe, but nothing that screamed murderer. We so often assume killers wear their darkness on their sleeve, but he wore a harmless hiker persona until he snapped. User under the nickname Golden Track. He was my older brother's best friend. I had known him for years, from childhood birthdays to random sleepovers. He always seemed charming, popular, the life of the party. As we grew older, I heard he got into some questionable dealings, but my brother swore he was a good guy deep down. I recall him once telling me that he had a short fuse, that he hated betrayal more than anything. I laughed it off, figuring it was tough talk. He never showed aggression around me, never threatened me. Then, one winter, my brother discovered his friend had been involved in a murder-for-hire scheme. The friend had allegedly accepted money to take out a local figure. My brother was shaken, said it could not be true, but the police had solid evidence. The friend was caught after a sting operation. I remember the day I stood in our living room, watching the news mention his name, my mother gasping. My brother turned pale, repeating that it made no sense. Yet the friend eventually confessed, showing no remorse. I realized I'd grown up around a person who joked at our family barbecues, teased me about little things, but behind that laid the willingness to kill for money. That shattered my naive perspective. I'd never glimpsed real darkness in him, or so I thought. Maybe I'd overlooked subtle signs. The bragging about fights, the longing for easy cash, the casual disregard for moral lines. I realized how thoroughly a killer can compartmentalize. He was a friend around us, a gun for hire in secret. That revelation shook me to my core. My brother felt betrayed, disgusted at how easily his best friend had hidden that monstrous side. It taught me that you never truly know who might be capable of lethal actions, even among those who share your childhood memories. User under the nickname Sunset Stride. I used to volunteer at an animal shelter. One of our fellow volunteers was an older man with a gentle smile, known for caring for injured dogs. Everyone admired his dedication. He would bring in warm blankets, buy extra treats for the animals. People thought he was a saint. I too admired him since he would show up early, stay late, never complain. He had no family, or so he said, and spent his free time with the dogs. Over time, I noticed he never asked about adopting any. He claimed his landlord forbid pets, so he simply volunteered. Fine, we thought. Then a rumor emerged that he had once gone to prison for assault. We dismissed it as gossip. Could a man so loving toward animals commit violence? About a year into volunteering, I arrived one morning to find police searching the shelter. They asked about him, requested his records. We discovered he had vanished. Later that day, the staff learned from investigators that he was wanted for multiple murders, primarily of people who had reminded him of an abusive figure from his past. They speculated that his affection for animals was a twisted attempt to cling to something pure while he wrestled with a compulsion to harm. Evidence linked him to unsolved homicides in multiple states. We stared at each other in disbelief. That kindly volunteer who carefully fed orphan puppies was also a suspected serial killer. The whiplash was unreal. Eventually, they caught him in another state driving with stolen plates. The media reported that he confessed to at least 5 murders. Standing in the empty shelter, I looked at the kennels he used to clean, hearing echoes of his gentle tone, how he patted a trembling dog's head. He had tears in his eyes sometimes, or so I remembered, yet he had no mercy for certain people he targeted. That contradiction is the hardest to wrap my head around. The day I fully accepted it was the day I realized I'd known a killer. The one who used to talk about saving dogs, who wore an apron splattered with puppy chow, had an endless capacity for cruelty to humans. User under the nickname Willowtime. He was my aunt's boyfriend. I saw him mostly at family gatherings. He seemed ordinary, perhaps a bit too quiet, but Aunt Linda was smitten. He was polite around me, always offering to do the dishes or fix a leaky faucet. My mother disliked him, said there was something unnatural in his smile. I shrugged it off, thinking that maybe she was overprotective. Over the next year, he became a fixture in our family events, always bringing pies or snacks, blending in. Sometimes I noticed how he rarely made eye contact, as if he had secrets. He wore a cross around his neck but never once talked about faith or church. The strangest detail was that he almost never laughed, even when everyone else did. I chalked it up to introversion. Aunt Linda announced she was pregnant. We were all happy for her. Then, a few days after that announcement, she went missing. He told us she ran off after an argument, took her car, and had not returned. My mother felt alarmed, suspecting foul play. The police questioned him, but no evidence emerged initially. Over the next 2 months, we searched for Aunt Linda. The heartbreak was unbearable. Eventually, a hiker discovered a shallow grave in a wooded area. Aunt Linda's remains were identified. The shock rattled the entire family. The boyfriend was arrested soon after, when more evidence surfaced tying him to the burial site. He eventually confessed. My mind reeled. This man who had sweetly offered me slices of pie, who fixed Aunt Linda's sink, was a murderer who ended her life while she carried his child. That is the day I realized how easy it can be for a killer to slip into a family, smile politely, and hide the darkest impulses. We had let him into our homes. My mother said she always had a bad feeling, but none of us guessed it was lethal. The nightmares still wake me up. I see his face, the half-smile he offered, how I once let him drive me to the store. We never know how close we stand to evil until it is too late. These are the stories from individuals who discovered too late that someone in their orbit was capable of killing. They describe the moment they realized something was off, the subtle signs they should have noticed, or the shock upon learning the truth. In each of these accounts, the common thread is how normal a murderer can appear, blending into daily life. Some display flickers of cruelty or strangeness. Others remain polite, subdued, or even kind. Only when the mask falls do we see that real danger lurked beneath their facade. At times we suspect, yet brush it aside, telling ourselves not to be paranoid. Looking back, these storytellers realize that ignoring those warning signals can have tragic consequences. They speak now as a warning, a collective voice reminding us that the face of evil might not snarl or boast. It might simply sit beside you at dinner, sipping coffee, or working on a class project, quietly harboring lethal secrets.